Top 3 bands George Harrison hated. George Harrison was a British musician, singer, and songwriter, who gained fame as the lead guitarist of the Beatles, one of the most important and influential bands in the history of rock music. His influence on the group and pop music in general extended beyond just singles. He soon developed a deep interest in Indian music. In 1970 the Beatles announced the end of the band. I believe it was largely a relief for all 4 members, despite the greatness they had achieved together. After the breakup of the Beatles, Harrison pursued a solo career. However, he did express disdain towards certain bands, particularly as the music scene changed from the 1960s onward. Here are 3 bands George Harrison hated the most. Sex Pistols. George Harrison wasn't a fan of the Sex Pistols. In the 1970s, it was common for punk bands to criticize the Beatles, and they took pride in doing so. Punk rock emerged in the late 1970s and disrupted the establishment, with the Sex Pistols being one of the most visible and provocative acts of the movement. However, George wasn't a fan of punk rock, openly criticizing both the genre and the Sex Pistols in particular. He felt that punk rock lacked melody, and this musical deficiency was a major reason for his dislike of the Sex Pistols. Though they played with confidence, their lack of melody and musical skill turned him off. In a 1979 interview with Rolling Stone's Mick Brown, George talked about his thoughts on contemporary music. While he praised artists like Bob Dylan, Elton John, and Eric Clapton, he expressed his dislike for punk rock, preferring songs with strong melodies. He also criticized punk rock drummers, saying they lacked the talent of early rock and roll drummers. Regarding the Sex Pistols, he felt a bit sorry for them, recalling an interview where one of the band members talked about being destined for factory work, which George found depressing, especially for England, a country he viewed as being in a constant state of negativity. In the same interview, George described punk bands' music as unrefined noise, lacking in musicianship, and expressed sympathy for the Sex Pistols' bleak outlook. The Hollies. At that time, criticizing a Beatle was almost like blaspheming the Pope. Every British band owed a lot to them, and the Hollies were regularly appearing on the same top 10 charts as the Beatles. In 1965, the Hollies' producer, Ron Richards, introduced them to a demo of If I Needed Someone. By then, most of the Hollies' hits were written by outside songwriters. George Harrison, upon hearing they were recording his song, responded sharply, saying, "Tell people I didn't write it for the Hollies." He expressed his dissatisfaction with their rendition, calling it rubbish and saying it wasn't his kind of music. He felt they had ruined it, criticizing their sound as mechanical, like session musicians who didn't know each other. Many listeners felt the Hollies were trying to imitate the Beatles with the single, and John Lennon also disapproved of their interpretation, as he had never been a fan of the Hollies' style. U2. The former Beatles guitarist, George Harrison, harshly criticized modern music, particularly what he saw as the rise of ego in the industry. By 1997, musical tastes were shifting, and U2 had released a very different kind of album, pop, along with their Pop Mart tour, which wasn't as well received as their previous efforts. U2's popularity, especially in the US, was somewhat waning, and they were facing criticism from various quarters. Harrison's remarks likely didn't help, and Bono responded accordingly. Harrison took aim at Bono and U2, saying, "Bono and his band are so egocentric. The more you jump around, the bigger your hat is, the more people listen to your music. The only thing that matters is selling and making money. It has nothing to do with talent." Harrison contrasted this with the Beatles, claiming they had lasting value, unlike bands like U2 or the Spice Girls, whom he doubted would be remembered in 30 years. Despite the criticism, U2 had already become a hugely influential band by the 1990s, with many groups from that era and the 2000s citing them as a major inspiration. Bono, clearly angered by Harrison's comments, responded with a rude gesture and slammed the ex-Beatle during a Pop Mart tour stop in Leeds. Speaking to the crowd, Bono sarcastically said, "Good people of Yorkshire, you are making a terrible mistake," in response to Harrison's claim that U2's music was worthless and would soon be forgotten. Let us know in the comments if you agree with George Harrison's critiques. Do you think he was right, or did he miss the mark on some of these legendary